Central banks around the world are going to be meeting this week, and here's what you need to know: what it all means, and more importantly, what we need to be looking for. Now, their interest rate policies in particular don't really have much of an influence on the real economy, but they can impact financial markets, especially in the short run. Those interest rate policies are also, at times, a reflection of economic circumstances and even financial risks that may not be as widely appreciated. So we can gauge how bad a situation might be becoming by how a central bank responds to it. If they say they are ultra cautious about inflation risk, but then in the very next meeting turn around and start cutting rates, that's a crucial sign that the conditions may have deteriorated, and not on the inflation front. We've got the ECB that already did its rates and did its policy meeting a couple weeks ago, but this is the week where they all start coming up in one huge bunch. We've got the Bank of Japan tonight, which is maybe possibly the first rate hike there since 2007. The Federal Reserve, of course, on Wednesday. We're not looking for hikes. We're going to be watching dots, which is as ridiculous as that is. Australia is also tonight, which will give us a sense of spillover from China's troubles. Brazil on Wednesday. They've already been aggressively cutting interest rates. The Czech Republic on Wednesday. Maybe they're going to start aggressively cutting interest rates. At least that's the expectation. The Swiss National Bank on Thursday. The Bank of England also on Thursday. Turkey. Bank of Mexico. So major economies all over the world. Policymakers getting together and in one small sense helping us decide what the actual risks are in these economies. Is it actually inflation? Is there a risk that it's going to restart around the world? Or has the balance shifted toward weakness and even recession, such that even hawkish central bankers are turning more and more into doves? That's what we need to keep our eye on. Before we get fully immersed into central bank week, I do want to let you know that Eurodollar University is having an upcoming spring sale starting next week. Best prices on all our research subscriptions, as well as value bundles and memberships and the daily briefing, deep dive analysis, all of it. Upcoming spring sale at Eurodollar University. It began almost 2 weeks ago, March 7th, with the ECB. The ECB basically came out with updated forecasts that downgraded their consumer price increases to relatively close to their target, as well as basically saying the economy in Europe in 2024 is going to look a lot like 2023, which 2023 was a recession in Europe. Whether they want to call it that or not doesn't actually matter. We're following central bank policies as a source of information, because as they shift more toward the dovish direction, that means they're more and more sensing and appreciating weakness in the real economy over and above whatever lack of confidence they may have over disinflation and continuing as consumer price rates fall further and further. So from the ECB, we go to Japan. Japan's the big one tonight that many people have been watching for quite some time, for what should be obvious reasons. The Japanese have been stuck in a deflationary mindset for more than 3 decades, and if the Bank of Japan is right about its view of inflation, they may have gotten themselves out of it, though not for anything the Bank of Japan did. Again, central bank policies correspond to nothing in the real economy. This would have been the supply shocks effect on the Japanese system, not QQE and negative interest rates, which have been ongoing steadily for longer than anyone cares to remember at this point. Which is one reason why the Bank of Japan would like to hike interest rates, so it can at the very least it can say, see, we did it. We'll take a little bit of credit for it. At least we got out of that interest rate policy. We can move on to another phase in whatever central banks that would be. The big one as far as the Bank of Japan has been concerned is wages, not necessarily consumer prices. This is about a wage price spiral. And it makes some intuitive sense. If consumer prices are rising rapidly, consumer prices can't continue to rise rapidly unless wages and pay and income keeps up with consumer prices. The very problem that we're seeing all across the rest of the world is where recessions are coming from. because workers in particular fall further and further behind. As we've seen in the United States, consumer spending has fallen way off, which leads to all sorts of big problems, including labor market problems. And rather than risk more inflation, we're more into recession than not. In Japan, they already have the recession, or at least they had the technical recession until the government revised it a little bit just recently. But more than anything, wages. Consumer prices have slowed down even though the Bank of Japan hasn't done anything really different, which again shows you how little central bank policies correspond to actual events in the real economy. But what the Bank of Japan has also said is that if wages start to really rise, then we're going to have to act. And over the past weekend, the Japanese Trade Union Confederation, which is a confederation of 771 unions, which is also known as Rengo, they reported some of the highest average wage increases in 33 years. They got 5.28% on average, which is well above the 3.8% last year. Although the 3.8% from last year was already a 30-year high, and it didn't lead to reignited consumer price pressures or accelerating consumer price numbers. And in fact, it still led to recession in Japan. Whether they call it a technical one or not, Japan's in a bad situation. However, the Bank of Japan said we're going to focus on wages, and the wage numbers came in stronger than expected. So the Bank of Japan is almost certainly going to hike rates because in the end, this has nothing to do with the economy or consumer prices or really wages. This is about an increasingly unpopular government in Japan for these reasons of recession as well as consumers feeling pressured. And so the government wants to, like in the Western world, appear to be doing something tangible that they can point to and say, hey, this is very different and we're doing something really strong about this consumer price problem that we have. And I think that's what's happened. The wage numbers give the Bank of Japan the final justification to go ahead and hike rates so that the government in Tokyo can say, we're doing something about consumer prices. See, we feel your pain. And as far as we're concerned, if the Bank of Japan were not to raise rates tonight, that would be a critical signal that they're actually more worried about growing weakness, especially in Japan, weakness coming from the outside in. Also tonight, Reserve Bank of Australia, giving us a sense of fallout from China. Will they be pivoting this year? The Aussie economy has gotten incredibly weak as consumer prices look like they're about to weaken too. We've seen commodities like iron, a key export from Australia, really collapse here recently, which has to be unnerving to anyone down under these days. So the economy was already close to recession in the fourth quarter of last year, and in per capita terms, because Australia is experiencing a population boom, it has been in recession for quite some time. So output isn't growing enough, or output isn't growing fast enough to keep up with population growth. So on a per capita basis, GDP is in recession. Got some weak household spending numbers for the month of February just recently. And then consumer prices have dipped. They came in weaker than expected, down to 3.4% in Australia in January, which is equal to December, when it was expected they were going to accelerate up to 3.6%. So it'll be interesting to see just how the Reserve Bank of Australia responds to this. Again, balance between weakness, very clear weakness on the one side, and decelerating consumer prices that may not be decelerating as quickly as policymakers or politicians would like. And so what balance is the Reserve Bank of Australia going to strike between those two positions? That could tell us where policymakers are thinking about in terms of actual risks in the Australian economy that isn't necessarily about just the Australian economy. On Wednesday, Brazil, Banco do Brasil, they've already done 5 straight 50 basis point rate cuts since last August. And the justification was they didn't want real rates to rise too precipitously when consumer prices were falling. Because remember, real rates are simple mathematics where you have the nominal rate, and if consumer price pressures are falling, therefore consumer inflation rates are decelerating. That means that decelerating inflation rates, real rates begin to rise. With real rates is the distance between those two. And if real rates continue to rise, absent any kind of change anywhere in either policy or the economy, according to central bank theories and mainstream economics, that means it'll be increasingly restrictive on an economy they may not necessarily want to be restrictive of. So in Brazil, consumer prices in February down to 4.5%, which is right at the top end of the new 2024 range from the central bank. Their target for this year is 3% plus or minus 1.5 percentage points on either side of that range. And of course, the biggest risk to Brazil's economy, other than in the consumer price pressures continuing, external risk from the United States as well as China. On the one side, the U.S. is supposed to be strong and resilient, maybe too strong and resilient, holding Brazil's economy up because it is its biggest trading partner. On the other side, you've got the Chinese, which many people are hoping becomes strong and resilient, but up to now has been more weaker than not. So there's a tug of war there. How is central bank officials reading all of the continued updates from the U.S. of trade with the United States, trade with China, as well as some payroll growth slowing down more recently too. And GDP, notably in Brazil, real GDP was exactly zero in both the third quarter and fourth quarter. These are quarter over quarter rates, which means Brazil's economy had stalled out at the final half of last year. So not just the end of the year, the complete second half of 2023. So again, Brazil already weak, still concerned about consumer prices, but coming down on the side of at least cutting rates, though with their Selic rate still up around 11.25%, they consider that highly restrictive too. So what we're really watching here is if maybe central bank officials there and policymakers begin to vote for maybe a more aggressive than expected series of rate cuts from here. Are they content to continue to cut at a 50 basis point per meeting rate? Is there some forward guidance that maybe they're going to change course at some point in the near future? That's what we need to be watching from Brazil. Because again, it could tell us something about US, China, the global economy too. Thursday, Swiss National Bank. Consumer prices in February already declined to their lowest increase in 2.5 years at just 1.2%, which is well within the Swiss National Bank's target. And their policy rates over there have been steady since last June, so they've been pausing for well over a year. And SNB President Thomas Jordan, back in mid-December on Bloomberg TV, he said, monetary conditions are adequate, and we do not have to hint at any change of monetary policy in the future. Price stability is already ensured given our newest inflation forecast. However, GDP was negative in the second quarter of last year, and then only about 3% quarter over quarter in the other three quarters, which meant for the full year 2023, output grew at just 0.8%. So not exactly a great year in Switzerland. So what we're looking for from the Swiss National Bank, as they say, hey, we're pretty confident about consumer prices, even though they do expect an acceleration due to oil in the near term, it doesn't appear like they expect that to be anything more than a transitory oil price shock, mini shock. So the clues that we're looking for as the Swiss National Bank seeks to potentially transition to a dovish set of policies wouldn't necessarily be rate cuts, at least not right away, whether or not they start selling francs in their foreign exchange operations. That would be a sign that the Swiss National Bank has transitioned from somewhat concerned about consumer prices to, yep, we're confident about consumer prices to, okay, now we need to really see if we can't do something about the economic weakness. So if we see an announcement of foreign exchange operations selling francs, that would be tantamount to shifting policy toward one that would be more like rate cuts around the rest of the world. From Switzerland to England, the old lady of Threadneedle Street, the Bank of England. The Bank of England starts out with the same problems as everyone else. They've got recession on the one side and consumer prices on the other. Recession that doesn't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon, although the Bank of England said, we think that the economy started out 2024, at least on a modest bounce. Their forecasts show that they're not expecting anything different in 2024 from 2023, which would be like Europe 2 straight basically recessionary years with no real expansion whatsoever. However, on the other side, like in the United States, consumer prices, while slowing, remain well above target. So which way will the Bank of England tilt? Will they tilt toward those consumer prices or the already harmful recession? One clue will come on Wednesday when England reports its CPI data, which is supposed to fall from a 4% year-over-year rate to 3.5%. So we'll see if that remains on track. And Governor Bailey said, "My big concern was that this duration would fuel the embedding of second round effects." And by duration, he means the length of time it's taking consumer price disinflation to really get going here and keep going. Now, tentatively, these concerns, I think, have reduced. So it sounds like they're a little bit more confident on consumer prices continuing to fall. And a lot of it has to do with labor market weakness, not just GDP and technical recessions, but we've seen, like Japan, pay rises have increased, but also, unlike Japan, we've seen unemployment start to tick up, and redundancies, as they track in England, have really increased. The redundancy rate in January was 4.6 per 1,000 workers, which was more than double the 2.2 back in October. So you got job losses that have accumulated, and the Bank of England, again, not forecasting much economic output growth and expansion this year at all. So massive weakness, potentially getting into the labor market. At the same time, still not sure about consumer prices. Which way will the Bank of England go? Maybe not rate cuts at this meeting, but as far as changing their messaging and some of their tone moving forward here. One last one I want to go over here, Mexico. Mexico, first of all, because of its close proximity to the United States, and also because there's something that I've been watching, the auto industry, which has been, up to now, one of the positive counter-cyclical forces around the world. Because the auto industry was late to catch up out of the supply shock. It was one of the most affected by the supply shock, and it took a long time to get out of it. And as the auto industry was catching up, particularly U.S. demand for cars, pulling production from all over the world, including from Japan as well as Mexico, that meant there was one positive, growing and accelerating positive force in the especially industrial economy as the inventory cycle, the downswing in the inventory cycle was plaguing pretty much everywhere. So what we've seen recently is that in the United States, demand for autos has softened a little bit. And there are some signs that production of vehicles and automobiles in Japan and Mexico in particular are starting to have a negative impact. And if the auto industry goes into a downturn right in this vicinity of the calendar here in 2024, that could be a potentially accelerated force or an accelerating force to the downside in all of these global economies. And maybe the Mexican central bank is feeling the same thing too. Now, Banxico, as it's known, has paused its interest rate policy for seven meetings in a row, but they've already made some noises about thinking rate cuts here. They've shifted to more dovish language, and even though consumer prices in Mexico bounced somewhat higher on especially food with El Nino, especially in February, the core rate has moved lower anyway, and core rate central bankers like to focus on. Now, GDP in the fourth quarter of last year in Mexico reflected what looks to be this industrial slowdown. Just 0.1% quarter-over-quarter growth. That's the final quarter of last year, well below the 1.1% in the third quarter. But in addition to the possible industrial slowdown related to the automobile sector, there's also the nearshoring of production capacity closer to the United States, moving production from China and other places around the world, getting it closer and taking advantage of NAFTA. That was a huge trend in construction from the middle of 2022 into 2023 that may have plateaued because of the global economic cycle too. So Mexico and weakness there is potentially a global cyclical indicator of what may be enough to get policymakers' attention and have them shift from this multi-meeting, multi-month pause into a more concrete, if not rate cuts at this meeting, then laying out the steps in what they call the forward guidance toward rate cuts. Another one shifting toward weakness rather than consumer prices, even though consumer prices are still, the consumer price rates are still up in the 4s and 4.5s. So well above targets and uncomfortable if you're a central banker. Will they choose weakness or consumer prices? And of course, the big one that most people are going to pay attention to, that's the Federal Reserve. We don't really need to cover much about that. The Fed is not going to hike rates on Wednesday. It's not going to cut rates on Wednesday. Most people are going to be watching the dots to get a sense of how much the Fed is going to continue to flip-flop in the other direction. Remember, in December, they said, we're not talking about rate cuts. And then middle of December, they said, yeah, we're talking about rate cuts. And then sometime in January, they said, we're not talking about rate cuts, at least not till the second half of the year. Where's the Fed going to come down, given recent data from the labor market that is weaker than expected? I'm not talking about the household survey, or not talking about the establishment survey, talking about the household survey. The unemployment rate, something they do watch, up 0.5 percentage point over the last 10 months to now 3.9%. That's one that might get the Fed's attention there. How much it does, that's what we're hoping to get from the Fed's dots, Jay Powell's statements. We'll see what comes out on Wednesday. But overall, we've got central banks all over the world that appear to be shifting as economic circumstances shift. 2023 began all about consumer prices and maybe some fears over economic weakness, and then ended with central banks talking about consumer prices and saying, well, we see the disinflation, but we're not necessarily confident about it, and more recognizing potential for weakness. So there's a decided shift, not just in economic circumstances, but interpretation of those circumstances by central bankers. And we expect that shift in both the economy as well as central banker behavior to continue in 2024. So this week gives us a very condensed window into that process, at least from the central bank perspective. So we'll keep an eye out on all of these policy gatherings and what comes out of them to see where in the process they think that we are. And that can tell us conservatively what might actually be happening in each of these places. One central bank that has been cutting rates already, that's the Chinese. Economic, financial weaknesses, all sorts of problems there. That's the video I've got linked below. As always, I thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.